Good evening and congratulations and welcome to the world of Instagram Live.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
this
my first time.
is this your first time? Well, I'll be gentle. Thank you very much
Great.
for doing this. How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. Enjoying what looks to be a reasonably nice day today, and waiting for winter to come. And of course, we're in Washington, and so there's rumblings about various groups on the right and the left coming tomorrow to demonstrate. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, listen, you are a great person to talk about what should be going on right now between President Trump and President-elect Biden. I don't know if you watched the president's news conference. He's obviously quite steamed about the timing of the vaccine and spent a lot of time talking about that and talking about how great the economy was doing. Do you know Donald Trump at all?
I mean, I met him once or twice many years ago. I actually was a judge with his sister, Mary Ann Trump Barry, who's a wonderful person, very smart, and an excellent judge. But I've only met Trump a couple times over the last maybe 20 years.
Well, I know that you and three other former secretaries of Homeland Security have said that it's time for the Biden transition process to begin. Why did you all feel it was important to come forward and issue that statement, Mike?
Well, we had the responsibility of protecting the country against national security threats. And I remember September 11th came very shortly after the delayed count with respect to Bush versus Gore, which slowed up the transition process. And that had an impact on our ability to put into place the people that we needed to respond. So we really had to scramble. As a consequence, President Bush told me, which I agreed with, that when he left office, he wanted a seamless transition with the incoming Obama people. So we prepared briefings. We sent people down to see then Governor Napolitano. We actually did an exercise to prepare them for what they might have to do if they hit office. And I actually agreed to stay an extra day for the inauguration just to have continuity if there was an attack of some kind.
It's interesting you mentioned that because the 9/11 Commission actually cited the delayed transition as one of the problems in terms of U.S. preparedness on that terrible day. So this is something you take very, very seriously.
Yes, I and my colleagues who were both served under Democrats, and Tom Ridge and I under Republican. And this is about America. It's not about party. It's not about whether someone's ego is being massaged or not. It's about, do we put people at risk? And let me add as well, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Putting aside terrorism and violence, just making sure that we prepare the incoming administration for the process of distributing a vaccine when one is ready is itself an urgent requirement.
So obviously, vaccine-related logistics should be, they need to be discussed because I know that President Trump talked about the fact that seniors and special people need, or I guess certain members of the population are going to get the vaccine sooner rather than later. But still, it's unclear if this distribution is going to be happening before or after the inauguration, right?
Well, I think it's unlikely to be significant before the inauguration because it's hard for me to see that the vaccine will be scaled
right
by the beginning of January. But what you need to do is to prepare in advance. You need to get all of the agencies that would be involved, which would be Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, and Defense, see who would play what role in getting the vaccine to where it needs to get, in storing it in a safe way, and actually administering it. And that also requires cooperation with the private sector. And without a transition, the incoming administration will not really have full visibility into the plans, if there are any, that have been developed over time. And that, again, puts the country at a disadvantage.
For those who are just joining, I'm talking with former Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff, who was the head of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009. He and three other former secretaries of Homeland Security issued a statement urging President Trump. It's Mike Chertoff, everyone, urging President Trump to start the transition. So you talked about with the vaccine and with the pandemic, how necessary this transition is in terms of, but let's talk about security in general. We've seen Mike Esper was fired as the Secretary of Defense. Key positions are now being filled by Trump loyal. Talk about sort of your overall concerns about national security at this moment in time.
I would say that, everybody understands that when you're doing a transition, under the best of circumstances, our adversaries, whether they be foreign or whether they be terrorists, domestic terrorists, see an opportunity to get away with doing things they might not otherwise imagine they can do. And so what you need to do is actually up your game and be better prepared than you normally would be so that you reduce the temptation and so you can respond effectively. And in addition to refusing to go ahead with the transition, which, by the way, the law requires, the Trump White House is now beginning to get rid of the people who actually have some experience operationally and could deal with the issue. So putting cronies in is not going to look really good if people wind up losing their lives because they don't know what to do in the case of an emergency. This is literally playing Russian roulette with the American people out of a sense, to be honest, of vindictiveness.
And let's talk about some of the important documents. Since you were very intimately involved in the transition between President Bush and President Obama, there's a lot of material, documents, policy manuals, et cetera, that really need to be preserved. And how concerned are you that the Trump administration isn't preserving some of these key documents?
Well, so first of all, the law requires documents to be preserved. Now, I think it'd be really practically difficult to destroy a whole lot of documents because they're usually duplicate copies. My bigger concern is that in delaying the transition, we are not giving the incoming team the most current intelligence. We're not beginning to process their security clearances, which are critical for them to be able to review intelligence. And it's that intelligence that's going to inform them about what the threats are, what we have underway to avert the threat, and what kinds of capabilities they may need to deploy after they take office. So again, you're literally throwing roadblocks up in the way of a smooth transition.
Somebody asked about, one of the people who's joining this conversation asked about Emily Murphy and the GSA and her refusal. I mean, to quote Alexander Haig, or paraphrase, who's in charge here? I mean, who can say to Emily Murphy, I'm sorry, but this is the law. As you said, it's the law. How can she basically defy that?
Well, I don't know her. I don't know what is in her mind and why she feels she can't make the determination. I understand that we don't have an official certification of the results yet. That comes in about 2 to 3 weeks, even though it's very clear, particularly given what was announced today, that Joe Biden is well ahead and there's no conceivable way the result is going to get reversed. So if she was being responsible, she would go ahead and do it. Now, whether she's afraid she'll be criticized or trolled online or fired, I'd be speculating about.
Someone said that Emily Murphy went to the University of Virginia Law School, my alma mater. I have no idea if that's true, but I'll have to check that out. Now, Joe Biden is kind of downplaying, Mike, the importance of this transition. But what are some of the things that he should be hearing about right now? You talk about the importance of a transition, but can you get a little more granular about some of the briefings he should be receiving right at this moment in time?
He should be hearing, first of all, what are the Russians and the Chinese up to? The Russians, have conducted disinformation. They've done cyber attacks. There is reporting that the Russians are trying to steal data about vaccines. He needs to understand what is currently coming out of Russia and China and Iran and North Korea in terms of trying to exploit this gap. He needs to understand what the situation with terrorism is. We've had some jihadi terrorist attacks in Europe. Is there a realistic threat here? What cases are being worked on? And maybe even more significant for this country, domestic terrorism. We've had more deaths through domestic terrorism in the last 2 or 3 years than from jihadi terrorism by a significant margin. Are there plans in the work by extremists to carry out acts of violence? What is the FBI doing to deal with that issue? These threats are exactly what he should be being briefed on. And then finally, what are the preparations underway with respect to the vaccine and the pandemic?
You know, you served in a Republican administration. What do you make of the fact that so many Republicans are either being silent or defending the president and his actions and his contention that somehow this election was rigged, despite the fact that I guess the Homeland Security folks said, let me see what you said it was this, or they said it was the safest election or the most accurate election. Let me find out. I have something about that got announced today or yesterday.
Yeah, they basically said this election has gone as well or better than any election in history. There's zero evidence of significant fraud. There was no voter intimidation. All of the authoritative voices of the government have rejected any idea of fraud. Why Republican politicians in the Senate feel they want to pretend they don't know that is a mystery to me. I don't know whether they're afraid that President Trump's going to turn voters against them for future elections. But look, Katie, here's the bottom line. Why do you want to be in government? Is it just to keep getting reelected so you can get reelected? Or do you actually want to do something? When I was in office, I dealt with people on both sides of the aisle, and I didn't always agree with them, but I always felt that they were working in good faith to do what they thought was best for the country. And it's disappointing to me that some of the people I had a lot of respect for are now basically just parroting what the party line is, even though that's actually undermining our confidence in our democracy. We do not want to be like Viktor Orban's Hungary, creeping into an anti-democratic mindset.
Do you think the Trump administration will accept the findings? It was the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a top committee from the Department of Homeland Security, that called this election the most secure in history. Do you think the Trump administration is going to accept those findings?
Well, I think ultimately they won't have a choice. They're running all these legal cases. They've lost, I think, virtually every case of significance. At some point, that rope is going to run out. And even some of the lawyers are now pulling out of representing the campaign because they have ethical obligations not to go to court and sue. And then when they're asked for evidence, they say, we don't have any evidence. So I think the legal challenges aren't going anywhere. Once the vote is certified by each of the states, the Electoral College then in mid-December meets and votes. And then it's just a ministerial matter. It gets presented to Congress. There is no legal mechanism that I'm aware of under these circumstances that would allow derailing of this process. So come January 20th, when Joe Biden gets sworn in, Donald Trump will not be president, period.
I read a pretty shocking figure, though. 70% of Republicans think that the election, something was wrong with this election. It was rigged, or there were, dead people voting, whatever, thing you want to choose. I mean, that's a huge number of people who have bought into this whole notion that this election was somehow fixed or unfair. That's going to have a big impact on our trust and faith in the democratic process of free and fair elections for many years to come.
Well, this is what really is concerning. I'm not really thinking there's any real possibility that Donald Trump will be able to stop Joe Biden from becoming president. But what worries me is he has laid the groundwork for a period of time in the future where there will be a real lack of trust in our government. And we see the proliferation of conspiracy theories more and more in recent years. We've always had some of that, and people have written books about, people who don't think we landed on the moon and 9/11 was caused by the United States. But now we have, in addition to this totally unfounded election rigging theory, this weird conspiracy called QAnon, which involves allegations that Trump is secretly working to unmask a giant child trafficking ring. None of this stuff makes any sense at all or has any evidence. But, a while back here in Washington, someone went with a gun into a pizzeria because he had read online in one of these sites that the pizzeria was trafficking children for Hillary Clinton. And fortunately, nobody got killed. But we have to really work to bring this country together and to inject truth and reality into the public discourse.
How worried are you about QAnon, about the Proud Boys, about this rise in white supremacy, hate groups, under various monikers? I was in Charlottesville during the so-called Unite the Right rally, and it was terrifying to see all these neo-Nazis and white supremacists completely, unashamed to say that, to spout their disgusting rhetoric. I mean, does the Department of Homeland Security have a handle on this? Because a lot of these people are operating in the shadows, less so than they used to. But how concerned are you, Mike, about that?
Yeah, I'm very concerned. I mean, I think Homeland Security has reported and issued reports indicating that this is now the most serious domestic terrorism threat. The FBI is investigating. We've seen that they have managed to arrest people from these extreme groups that were talking about carrying out acts of violence, for example, against Governor Whitmer of Michigan.
And also the governor of Virginia.
Yeah, Governor Northam. So we've always had this lurking out there. I mean, it goes back for decades, and it's waxed and waned. I vividly remember that in the 90s, you had a growth in these extreme right-wing groups. And then Timothy McVeigh blew up the federal building and killed a lot of children in a daycare center. I think everybody said, like, whoa, and they stepped back. But now it's been revived, partly because President Trump has tacitly, wink, wink, encouraged this. And by the way, I mean, there are left-wing extreme groups too. But right now, most of the violence and threat is coming from the right. Although the concern is that both sides will meet and clash. And then, of course, that will really be a precipitating event for violence. That's
a very scary thought. I know that the Proud Boys are sponsoring a march in D.C. this weekend called the MAGA March. So it's something that obviously U.S. officials have got to be aware of. And I know that President Obama talked about it in a recent interview as well, that more more people aren't speaking out, about this. Well, before we go, Mike Chertoff, have you ever, I mean, it's so nuts what's going on. Have you ever seen anything like it? Did you predict this would happen? I remember I talked to Bill Maher and he kept saying, oh, Trump isn't going to leave. And I was like, oh, Bill, you're crazy. But increasingly, it does seem as if he does not want to kind of concede or throw in the towel.
Well, of course, I can't predict what's in his mind. My guess is this. He'll never concede. He'll always claim it was stolen, just like you'll remember when he was inaugurated in 2017. He claimed that he had the biggest crowd ever on the mall, and your own eyes told you that was preposterous. And what he was basically saying is, don't believe your eyes, believe me. So I think he's alibying himself. But if you want my guess, he knows he's going to be out, and now he's trying to lay the groundwork for continuing to be a thorn in the side of the incoming administration, whether it's through a media enterprise whether it's by saying he's going to run in 2024. He's going to try to continue to exert a strong hold on the Republican Party. And at some point, the Republican leadership is going to have to decide, are they prepared to go along with that? Or are they going to start to declare their independence? So, I don't want to sugarcoat it. We have a lot of work to do as a society, and everybody's got to get involved in voting. And we also have to rebuild our sense of community. Whatever the differences in our policies, we are Americans, and we should rebuild that sense of solidarity that I remember very well after September 11th.
What do you think? What role did the media play in this?
To be honest, and this is not just social media, which helps people find, small groups get together and conspire, but even the mainstream media often reports things in a hysterical way or a hyped up way, which really feeds into the narrative that we're under attack from both sides. I think we need to reinvigorate the sense of professionalism that causes journalists to stop and take a deep breath before they run out with so-called breaking news.
So can you give me an example of that? Like, what do you mean exactly?
Well, I mean, I think that you wind up often getting news stories that repeat something that appeared on social media, and they'll say, well, social media says X, Y, Z, and then they'll feature it. Or, for example, in the 2016 campaign, they would run long stretches of live video of Donald Trump having rallies where people were yelling and screaming. That wasn't really news. What it was a desire to excite viewers by getting them emotionally wrought up one way or the other.
Well, also, as Les Moonves famously said, he's bad for the country, but good for business.
Right. And I'm afraid whether it's social media or regular media, there's too much of a tendency to look at getting people to watch because that has direct impact on revenue, that's what it's about. And I still think the reporters and the journalists I respect, and there are many that I do respect, don't play that game. They're more sober, they're more deliberate, and they are more skeptical. And we need to rebuild that sense of professionalism.
And maybe not cover every time Donald Trump tweets, for example. I think that's sometimes treated as breaking news. And I think that's the attention he craves. And, unfortunately, I think you're right. They're caught in this thing where he's good for ratings. So they put him on. And that's, to revisit Les Moonves' quote, that's bad for the country.
Right. And we have to educate our young people, even in elementary school, just as we've taught them don't engage with strangers over the internet. We should teach them how to evaluate whether something that appears on the internet or Twitter or even a news story, whether it's worthy of belief or not. We have to kind of re-engage on the critical thinking.
And the other thing is, people get caught in an echo chamber, and social media and these platforms feed them, similar material. I mentioned this, I don't know if anybody heard me in another interview, where my nephew's wife now gets the Wall Street Journal delivered to her home because she says, I don't want to just see what I'm getting fed. And there was something great about reading the news that everybody got instead of the news that they think you want. And I thought that was so interesting. She's going back, kind of like going to a flip phone. She's going back to getting the Wall Street Journal, which she said she's not necessarily aligned with at all politically, but she just wants to have it and see it. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Having a common platform where everybody sees the same thing is very helpful in disciplining some of the disinformation. And I will say one of the problems, I think this probably should be corrected, is they can curate your newsfeed now online so that things they think you're interested in are what you get.
Well,
right. And that allows somebody to speak out of both sides of their mouth. A politician can go to one group and say, I'm going to do all these violent things, and then go to another group and say, no, I want to be peaceful and promote peace. And the two sides won't be able to say, wait a second, these two statements don't match, they're contradictory. So we've got to really come up with a mechanism so that people, at least in the political arena, cannot curate what they say for very limited and insulated audiences.
That's interesting. I didn't really even think about how people could tailor different statements for different audiences, which is another problem, but it definitely exacerbates the divide by making people feel more passionately entrenched in their point of view because it's never really being challenged. They're getting affirmation, not information.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, it's great to talk to you, Mike. Thank you so much for doing this. Some people wanted me to turn the comments off, but a lot of times we do get some smart people. Sometimes we just get weird people, but I really, really appreciate it. And it's good to see you again. Any parting thoughts before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I do want to end on an optimistic note. I do have a lot of faith in the country and the resilience of the people. And before the election, there was a lot of legitimate concern about interference with voting, whether it be violence or online interference or attacks on critical infrastructure. And we, in fact, had record turnout, no real voter interference or disruption. Likewise with the count. It's gone much than some people feared. So I think the worst fears were not borne out, and that ought to give us the energy and the optimism to continue to manage this transition and then rebuild the trust and the bonds of commonality in our society.
And by the way, it's pretty miraculous. How did we keep foreign interference from screwing up the election? Do you know, were there mechanisms in place? Because the people deserve credit.
Yeah, I think part of it is disinformation. Frankly, the worst disinformation came from within the country.
Right.
But I think in terms of anything more active, I think we have sent a message over the last year or so that we will up the ante if our overseas adversaries start to use cyber to really try to create damage. And I think they were a little bit nervous about that. And to be honest, to the extent they usually want to sow distrust and disloyalty, we were doing the job for them. So they could just sit back and watch.
And that's I hate to leave it on a pessimistic note, but that's a very sad commentary. Yeah. You know, the whole purpose to sow mistrust and division in this country by foreign agents, they didn't need to do it because we were doing it ourselves.
Yeah, and we should not give them that pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, Mike, thank you so much. It's great to talk to you. Really appreciate your.
You be well.
And hopefully I'll see you face to face one of these days. If you guys like what you see, subscribe right here.